They were only seconds away from turning the homeless young man away. Instead, they gave him a warm meal, a bed in their barn, and one chance to start over. They never expected to see him again. Nearly 18 years later, a pickup truck rolled back onto the same ranch. Out stepped a battle-hardened U.S. Marine with his loyal German Shepherd canine by his side. He didn't come back just to say thank you. He came back because the people who had once taken him in were about to lose everything. And this time, he refused to let that happen. Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from? Drop your country in the comments below. A cold autumn wind swept across the Wyoming prairie, carrying the smell of rain toward the weathered fences of Windbreak Ranch. Windbreak Ranch rested several miles outside the quiet town of Lander, Wyoming, surrounded by rolling pasture, aging cottonwoods, and distant mountains already brushed with the season's first snow. The ranch had survived droughts, brutal winters, and cattle disease, but time had become its hardest enemy. Every loose fence board and weather-beaten gate carried the fingerprints of Graham Hartwell, a 62-year-old rancher whose life had been built with calloused hands instead of borrowed money. He was a broad, powerfully built man, though the years had begun to curve his shoulders. A neatly trimmed gray beard framed his weathered face, and deep blue eyes sat beneath heavy brows that rarely softened. 8 years earlier, he had buried his only son after a terrible ranch accident. Since that day, Graham had continued working because the cattle still needed feeding, but something inside him had stopped believing that life always rewarded good people. He had become slow to trust, and even slower to forgive. Inside the farmhouse, Mabel Hartwell quietly stirred a pot of beef stew over the old cast-iron stove. At 60, she remained graceful despite the stiffness that settled into her knees every cold morning. Silver-brown hair rested in a loose braid over one shoulder, and warm hazel eyes reflected a kindness that grief had never managed to erase. Losing her son had broken her heart without hardening it. While Graham had learned to protect himself from disappointment, Mabel had learned to recognize loneliness in others because she had lived with it herself every day. She glanced through the kitchen window and became still. Someone's coming. Graham barely looked up from the ranch ledger spread across the table. Neighbor? No. She watched the distant figure a moment longer. He's walking. That single word made Graham raise his head. Far down the dusty ranch road, a lone traveler walked toward the house. There was no horse beside him, no wagon, no pickup truck. Only a faded canvas backpack hanging from one shoulder and the slow, deliberate stride of someone who had learned to save every ounce of strength. Even from a distance, exhaustion seemed to cling to him like another layer of clothing. When he reached the porch, he stopped several feet away instead of stepping onto it. He removed his battered hat before speaking. "Good afternoon, sir." "Ma'am." His name was Jonah Calder. He looked no older than 20. Tall but noticeably lean, Jonah wore an old canvas coat patched at both elbows and boots repaired so many times they barely resembled the originals. A fresh cut stretched across his left cheekbone, while several days of light stubble shadowed a strong jaw that had not yet fully lost its youthful shape. His gray-blue eyes looked tired but remarkably steady. Graham had seen desperate men before. Their eyes usually darted around a property, searching for opportunity. Jonah's eyes did something different. They quietly observed broken fences, worn gates, the cattle grazing beyond the barn, and the cracked water trough near the corral. He wasn't studying what could be taken. He was studying what needed fixing. "What do you need?" Graham asked. "Work. We're not hiring." Jonah gave a slow nod, almost as though he had expected those exact words before reaching the porch. "I understand." For a brief moment, he looked toward the pasture again. I grew up on a cattle ranch. After my father died, I tried to keep it going, but I was too young. The herd got sick, the debt kept growing, and eventually the bank took everything. He did not ask for pity. He simply spoke the truth. I've been working ranches wherever I can ever since. Jonah tightened his grip on the strap of his backpack before meeting Graham's eyes once more. I don't need wages, just meals and a place to sleep. He paused only briefly. Let me stay, and I'll take care of your cattle. The words lingered in the cool afternoon air. Graham did not answer immediately. He studied the young man from head to toe, weighing every detail the way he inspected a horse before buying it. The patched coat, the worn boots, the fresh cut on his cheek. Everything suggested hardship, but hardship alone had never proved a man's character. We've taken men in before, Graham said at last, his voice calm but distant. One stole 2 saddles. Another disappeared with money from my wife's kitchen drawer. Another promised to work hard, then spent a week drunk in the barn. Jonah listened without interrupting. I don't blame you, he replied quietly. If I were in your place, I'd probably say no, too. The answer caught Mabel's attention. Most desperate men argued. Some begged. A few grew angry. Jonah did none of those things. He simply accepted Graham's caution as something earned rather than cruel. Graham folded the ledger shut. I'm sorry, son. I can't risk it. For a brief second, disappointment flickered across Jonah's face, but it disappeared almost as quickly as it came. He placed his hat back on his head and adjusted the old backpack resting against his shoulder. Thank you for hearing me out. He turned toward the road. Mabel watched him walk away, and an unexpected ache settled in her chest. There was something painfully familiar about the young man's quiet dignity. He reminded her of someone who had spent too long believing that every goodbye was permanent. Before she could speak, a sharp bark exploded across the ranch. Patch came racing from behind the barn. The old border collie was 12 years old, his once glossy black and white coat now sprinkled with gray around the muzzle. Age had slowed his body, but not his instincts. Since Graham had raised him from a puppy, Patch had never barked without reason. Every warning had saved livestock, equipment, or lives. The dog's frantic barking echoed through the valley. Then came another sound, the frightened bawling of cattle. Jonah stopped instantly. His head turned toward the southern pasture before anyone else reacted. "The south fence!" he shouted. Graham spun around. Several weathered fence posts had collapsed, and more than 30 head of cattle were already pressing through the opening toward the timber beyond the property. If they reached the trees before sunset, finding every animal again could take days. Without thinking, Jonah sprinted toward the corral. He reached the bay gelding but stopped with his hand hovering inches above the saddle. Instead of taking the horse, he looked back at Graham. He was waiting for permission. That single moment told Graham more about the young man than every word they had exchanged. "Take the bay," Graham shouted. "Yes, sir." Jonah mounted in one smooth, practiced motion. The horse settled beneath him almost immediately, responding to calm hands instead of force. Graham narrowed his eyes. That wasn't luck. It wasn't desperation. It was the instinct of someone who had spent years in a saddle. As Jonah and Patch raced toward the panicked herd, Graham found himself staring after the stranger with a feeling he had not allowed himself in a very long time. Hope. Whether that feeling would save his ranch or cost him another painful mistake was a question only the next few minutes could answer. Winter arrived slowly at Windbreak Ranch, covering the Wyoming hills with frost before surrendering them to deep snow. The mornings grew quieter, but the work never did. The week Graham Hartwell had promised as a trial quietly became a month. 1 month became 6, and before anyone thought to count again, nearly a year and a half had passed. Jonah Calder never asked whether he could stay. He simply woke before sunrise every morning, lit the stove before Mabel came downstairs, and stepped into the darkness with a lantern in one hand and feed buckets in the other. He repaired fences, one weathered post at a time, replaced loose shingles before winter storms could tear away the roof, rebuilt the cracked water trough with stone and fresh mortar, and even restored the old windmill pump that Graham had nearly given up on repairing. Nothing he did was dramatic. It was the quiet consistency of a young man treating borrowed ground as though it already belonged to his heart. Graham noticed everything. He never praised Jonah openly, but he stopped checking the young man's work after the first few months. That, more than words, was how Graham showed respect. Trust came slowly to a man who had spent years watching people disappoint him. Yet Jonah never once gave him a reason to doubt. Patch seemed to reach the same conclusion much sooner. The old border collie no longer waited outside Graham's bedroom every morning. Instead, he could usually be found sitting outside Jonah's small room behind the barn, tail gently brushing the wooden floor while waiting for the day's work to begin. Wherever Jonah walked, Patch quietly followed, as though the old dog had decided the young drifter had become part of the ranch long before the humans admitted it. The greatest change, however, happened inside the farmhouse. One evening, Mabel quietly noticed Jonah finishing supper in only a few minutes before setting his fork neatly beside the empty plate. "So fast?" she asked with a smile. Jonah looked embarrassed. "I guess I've always eaten that way." "Why?" He hesitated. "You never knew when someone might tell you to leave." The room fell silent. Jonah quickly forced a smile, regretting that the words had escaped him. "I didn't mean—" "You don't have to explain," Mabel interrupted gently. The following evening, she placed an extra slice of warm bread beside his bowl without saying a word. The next night, she did the same. Then the night after that. She never mentioned it. Neither did Jonah. But each evening, he looked at the bread for just a second before quietly whispering, "Thank you, ma'am." It was such a small gesture that Graham almost missed it. Yet over the following months, he noticed something else. Jonah no longer kept his backpack beside the door. One rainy afternoon, while carrying blankets into the small room behind the barn, Graham saw the faded canvas pack resting beneath the bed instead of leaning against the wall, where it had remained every night since Jonah arrived. He stood there longer than he intended. For the first time since losing everything, the young man had unpacked. Graham closed the door softly behind him, saying nothing. Some victories were too important to interrupt with words. By the middle of January, winter tightened its grip on the valley. Snow buried the lower fences, and every chore demanded twice the effort it had only months before. The cattle stayed close to the barn, while the creek behind the pasture disappeared beneath a sheet of ice that looked solid enough to trust, yet rarely was. Late one afternoon, Patch's sharp bark cut through the wind. Jonah looked up from stacking hay bales and immediately saw the old border collie racing toward the frozen creek. Graham was already there. A newborn calf had wandered onto the thin ice while following its mother. The frightened animal slipped through a narrow break, leaving only its front legs clinging desperately to the frozen edge. "I'm coming!" Graham shouted. Without waiting, the old rancher stepped onto the ice. "Sir, wait!" Jonah called. It was too late. The ice cracked beneath Graham's weight. He plunged waist deep into the freezing water, one hand still gripping the calf while the current pulled against both of them. For a single terrifying moment, Jonah saw history trying to repeat itself. He had already lost one father. He refused to lose another. Without stopping to think, Jonah grabbed the rescue rope hanging beside the barn and sprinted across the snow. He dropped to his stomach before reaching the broken ice, spreading his weight the way ranch hands were taught when crossing frozen creeks. Patch barked furiously from the bank, refusing to leave either man. "Take the rope!" Jonah shouted. Graham caught it with numb fingers. Jonah pulled with everything he had. The freezing water fought for every inch, but little by little, Graham slid toward solid ground, still refusing to release the terrified calf. Moments later, all three of them collapsed onto the snow. No one spoke. Only the wind did. That night, after dry clothes, hot coffee, and a roaring fire had slowly chased away the cold, Graham sat across from Jonah in the quiet farmhouse. Firelight reflected from the old rancher's thoughtful eyes. "You know," Graham said softly, "when you first walked up this road, I saw a drifter looking for another place to sleep." Jonah lowered his eyes. "I don't see that anymore." The room became still. "I see a man people can trust with their lives." Jonah felt the words settle deeper than any praise he had ever received. For the first time since losing his father's ranch, he realized he no longer measured his worth by what had been taken from him, but by what he could still give. Several weeks later, he made a decision he had carried silently for months. "I've been thinking about joining the United States Marine Corps," he admitted one evening. Neither Graham nor Mabel looked surprised. Graham slowly opened the kitchen drawer and removed an old silver pocket watch. Its worn case polished smooth by generations of Hartwell hands. "My father gave this to me," he said, placing it carefully into Jonah's palm. "His father gave it to him before that." Jonah stared at the watch in silence. "If you're going to wear this country's uniform," Graham continued, "wear it with honor. And when your duty is done," he gently closed Jonah's fingers around the watch, "bring this home." Jonah stood and embraced Graham first, then Mabel. Neither of them tried to hide the tears gathering in their eyes. A week later, the bus disappeared down the long dirt road beyond Windbreak Ranch. Patch remained sitting beside the front gate long after the dust had settled, his ears lifted toward the empty horizon, as though he believed that if he waited faithfully enough, the young man would someday come back. Nearly 18 years passed faster than any of them had imagined. Seasons came and went across the Wyoming prairie. Snow gave way to spring grass. Calves grew into breeding stock, and the cottonwoods around Windbreak Ranch stretched taller with every passing year. Yet every time Mabel crossed the front porch to collect the mail, a small part of her still hoped to find another envelope bearing Jonah Calder's familiar handwriting. At first, the letters came often. The earliest ones arrived from Marine Corps recruit training. Jonah never described how difficult the training was. Instead, he wrote about learning discipline, earning the respect of the Marines beside him, and remembering Graham's words whenever exhaustion tempted him to quit. Every letter ended the same way. "I still have the watch. I haven't forgotten my promise." Months later, the envelopes carried return addresses from military bases scattered across the country. Then they began arriving from overseas, their edges worn from long journeys through military mail. Jonah never mentioned locations or operations. He simply wrote that he was healthy, grateful, and still carried Windbreak Ranch with him wherever duty sent him. Graham answered every letter by hand. His handwriting remained neat despite growing stiffness in his fingers. He wrote about healthy calves, repaired fences, good hay seasons, and how Patch still insisted on checking every pasture before sunset, even after age had slowed him considerably. Mabel always added a page of her own. She filled the margins with ordinary things that rarely seemed important enough to mention. A new apple pie recipe, the first snowfall, a robin building its nest beneath the porch roof. She believed ordinary life was exactly what a Marine needed to remember while serving far from home. Neither of them ever wrote about their struggles. They never mentioned Graham's aching back that made climbing onto a horse more difficult each year. They never wrote about Mabel quietly rubbing medicine onto swollen joints before sunrise. They never admitted that repair bills were beginning to arrive faster than cattle sales. Some burdens, they believed, belonged at home. For several years, the letters continued crossing oceans and continents. Then they became fewer. Not because Jonah cared less. Life had simply become heavier. Long deployments stretched into one another. Responsibilities increased with every promotion. There were missions that lasted weeks without contact, and memories that refused to fit onto paper. During one deployment, Jonah suffered a shoulder injury while evacuating wounded Marines under enemy fire. The doctors repaired the damage, but the scar remained, along with nights when sleep refused to come easily. Even then, whenever he managed to write, one sentence never changed. "Tell Graham I'm bringing his watch home." One autumn afternoon, several years before retirement, Jonah received a new assignment that would quietly change the course of the rest of his life. He was introduced to Saber, a 3-year-old black and tan German shepherd, selected for military working dog duty. Saber stood taller than most shepherds, weighing nearly 90 pounds of lean muscle. His alert amber eyes constantly studied his surroundings, and his calm confidence reflected countless hours of disciplined training rather than aggression. Like Jonah, Saber trusted slowly, worked tirelessly, and never abandoned those under his protection. Neither of them knew that the partnership beginning that afternoon would someday lead both of them back to the ranch where a frightened young drifter had once been given a second chance. Years later, during what would become Jonah's final deployment, Saber saved his life. An explosion struck the edge of their patrol route, filling the air with dust, shattered concrete, and deafening silence. Jonah barely remembered hitting the ground before he felt Saber pulling against his vest, refusing to leave his side despite the chaos surrounding them. The mission ended successfully, but Saber suffered a serious injury to one of his hind legs while protecting another Marine from falling debris. Surgeons managed to save the dog's life, yet the injury ended his military working career. When the adoption paperwork was placed in front of Jonah, he signed it without hesitation. "You brought me home more than once," he whispered, resting a hand gently on Saber's neck. "Now it's my turn." Several months later, Jonah completed his transition out of the United States Marine Corps. The first thing he packed into his pickup truck was not his uniforms or medals. It was Graham's silver pocket watch. The second was Saber's bed. As Wyoming's familiar mountains slowly appeared beyond the windshield, memories returned with every passing mile. The long dirt road, the faded red barn, the smell of fresh-cut hay drifting across open pasture. Nearly 18 years had changed the world, yet one promise had remained untouched. When the pickup finally rolled through the old ranch gate, Saber stepped down first, moving with the slight limp that would stay with him for the rest of his life. Though retired, the German shepherd's amber eyes swept across the property with the same alert focus he had shown during every mission. Only after quietly checking his surroundings did he return to Jonah's side. The ranch looked smaller than Jonah remembered. The barn roof sagged in places. Several fences leaned dangerously. The paint on the farmhouse had faded beneath years of unforgiving Wyoming winters. He stood silently for a long moment before walking toward the porch. The front door opened. Graham stepped outside. He was nearly 80 now. His shoulders had narrowed with age, his beard completely white, and his movements carried the stiffness of countless seasons spent working land that demanded more each year than it returned. His eyes searched the stranger standing in the yard, polite but uncertain. "Can I help you?" he asked. Jonah smiled, but emotion stole his voice. Instead of answering, he slowly reached beneath his jacket and lifted the worn silver pocket watch hanging from the leather cord around his neck. For a heartbeat, Graham simply stared. Then his breathing caught. His weathered hand began to tremble. Jonah? The young drifter he had welcomed nearly 18 years earlier was gone. Standing before him now was a man. Without another word, Graham stepped forward and embraced him. Mabel appeared in the doorway moments later, tears already filling her eyes before Jonah even spoke her name. The joy of returning home, however, lasted only until Jonah looked beyond the porch. Half the cattle were gone. The old windmill stood silent. Fresh patches on the barn roof revealed repairs that could only postpone larger problems. That evening, after supper, Graham finally admitted the truth he had hidden through years of letters. Medical bills had drained their savings. Equipment kept breaking. The ranch no longer earned enough to survive. For the first time in more than 30 years, they were preparing to sell Windbreak Ranch. Jonah quietly lowered his eyes. The place that had once saved his life now needed someone to save it. Morning sunlight spilled across the Wyoming Valley, but Windbreak Ranch no longer looked like the place Jonah Calder had carried in his memories for nearly 18 years. The morning after Graham confessed the ranch's financial troubles, Jonah rose before dawn out of old habit. Years in the United States Marine Corps had trained his body to wake before the sun, yet this morning felt different. For the first time since leaving the service, he was not preparing for another mission overseas. He was standing exactly where he had always wanted to return: Windbreak Ranch. He walked slowly across the property with a mug of black coffee in one hand, while Saber moved quietly beside him. The retired German shepherd's injured hind leg gave him a slight limp, but nothing had dulled his discipline. His amber eyes scanned every fence line, every tree, every movement across the pasture. Retirement had ended his military service, not his instinct to protect. Jonah stopped beside the old windmill. The blades turned unevenly, groaning with every gust of wind. The wooden fence surrounding the nearest pasture leaned several inches farther than it should have. Rust covered the hinges of the main corral gate, and the cattle looked thinner than he remembered from years ago. He quietly understood something Graham had never written in his letters. The ranch had not grown old overnight. It had simply grown older. One repair that could no longer be afforded at a time. Behind him, Graham stepped out of the barn, carrying a toolbox that looked almost as worn as the man holding it. "You don't have to start working already," Graham said with a tired smile. "You came home to rest." Jonah looked around the ranch before answering. "I am home." The simple words left Graham silent. Jonah set down his coffee, picked up the old toolbox, and walked toward the damaged fence. "I've spent almost 18 years thinking about how I'd repay the two people who gave a homeless kid a place to belong." He smiled gently. "I finally realized I can't." Graham frowned. "What do you mean?" Jonah drove a new fence post into the earth with one firm strike. "I mean, some kindness can never be paid back." He looked at the cattle grazing quietly beyond the pasture. "The only thing you can do—" He paused before repeating the words that had changed his own life almost 2 decades earlier. "Let me stay." Another strike. "I'll take care of your cattle." This time there was no uncertainty in his voice. He was not asking for a bed. He was not asking for another chance. He was making a promise. Graham lowered his head, blinking away unexpected tears. The frightened young drifter who had once stood at this very fence, carrying everything he owned inside a worn backpack, had returned as a man whose greatest strength was not the uniform he had worn, but the gratitude he had carried for nearly 20 years. Over the next several days, Jonah threw himself into restoring Windbreak Ranch. He repaired gates, rebuilt broken sections of fence, serviced neglected equipment, and organized tools that had not been properly sorted in years. Yet the harder he worked, the more one troubling detail refused to leave his mind. Things were breaking far too often. A freshly repaired water valve failed less than 2 days later. Fence wire he had tightened one afternoon was found sliced clean before sunrise. Feed bins had been left open despite Graham insisting he had locked them himself. None of it felt random. Standing beside a freshly cut fence line one quiet evening, Jonah crouched to examine the ground. Saber lowered his nose beside the damaged post before suddenly freezing. The dog's ears lifted toward the dark tree line beyond the pasture. Someone else had been on the ranch, and they had not come by accident. Jonah remained kneeling beside the damaged fence long after the last light faded behind the mountains. Saber stood perfectly still beside him, his ears fixed toward the tree line while the evening breeze carried scents across the pasture. After years of working with a military canine, Jonah had learned to trust the dog long before trusting his own assumptions. He reached down and picked up a piece of freshly cut wire. The metal hadn't rusted. The cut was clean. Someone hadn't stumbled onto the ranch. Someone had come prepared. Back at the farmhouse, Graham listened quietly as Jonah laid the wire on the kitchen table. "I don't think this is bad luck anymore," Jonah said. Graham sighed heavily. "I've wondered the same thing a few times. You never told me." "I didn't have proof." Neither man spoke for a moment. Finally, Jonah looked up. "I'm not going after anyone." Graham frowned. "I know better than that." The old rancher recognized the calm expression on Jonah's face. It was the look of someone preparing for a mission, not a fight. The next morning, Jonah drove into Lander and introduced himself at the Fremont County Sheriff's Office. Sheriff Rebecca Danner was a 46-year-old law enforcement officer who had spent most of her career protecting ranch families scattered across the county. She had an athletic build, short chestnut hair beginning to silver around the temples, thoughtful green eyes, and the composed voice of someone who earned respect without demanding it. Raised on her parents' cattle ranch before joining law enforcement, Rebecca understood that land disputes were rarely just about property. They were about family, history, and survival. She listened without interrupting while Jonah explained everything he had found. When he finished, she leaned back in her chair. "You've done exactly the right thing." "What now?" "We collect evidence." Over the following week, discreet trail cameras appeared around Windbreak Ranch. Jonah positioned them near vulnerable fences, water valves, and the only vehicle entrances. Every camera was carefully hidden, and every evening he walked the perimeter with Saber, changing nothing about his routine to avoid alerting whoever had been watching the ranch. The breakthrough came 4 nights later. Just after midnight, Saber's head lifted before the security alert even reached Jonah's phone. The German Shepherd quietly walked to the front door and waited. Jonah checked the camera feed. 3 masked men had entered through the eastern pasture, carrying bolt cutters. Rather than rushing outside, Jonah immediately called Sheriff Danner. Within minutes, deputies quietly surrounded the property while the cameras continued recording. The intruders finished cutting nearly 40 feet of fencing before attempting to drive the cattle toward the opening. They never made it that far. Patrol vehicles emerged from the darkness with flashing lights, blocking every escape route. The arrests happened without a single shot being fired. The investigation that followed uncovered far more than vandalism. Financial records, phone messages, and bank transfers connected the suspects to Denton Pike, a wealthy commercial developer who had spent the last 2 years trying to purchase Windbreak Ranch. Pike, a clean-shaven man in his late 50s with expensive tailored suits, polished boots, and the patient smile of someone accustomed to getting his way, had discovered that a valuable underground spring lay beneath the Hartwell property. Unable to buy the ranch honestly, he had chosen to destroy its value instead. When Pike was taken into custody, the pressure hanging over Windbreak Ranch disappeared almost overnight. That evening, Graham stood beside Jonah at the front gate as cattle grazed peacefully across the pasture. "I always believed I gave a homeless boy a future," he said quietly. Jonah smiled. "You did?" Graham slowly shook his head. "No." He placed a weathered hand on Jonah's shoulder. "You came back and protected the family that first protected you." Jonah looked across the ranch, where Saber was calmly patrolling the fence line beneath the setting sun. For the first time in many years, Windbreak Ranch truly felt safe again. Spring returned to Windbreak Ranch with gentle rain, fresh grass, and the quiet promise that even the hardest winters did not last forever. Life settled into a rhythm that felt unfamiliar after so many years of uncertainty. The patrol cars disappeared from the ranch road, the broken fences were finally replaced with sturdy cedar posts, and the uneasy silence that had hung over the valley gave way to the ordinary sounds Graham Hartwell had almost forgotten. The steady creak of windmill blades, cattle grazing peacefully across the pasture, and the distant hammering of someone repairing a roof instead of merely patching it. That someone was almost always Jonah. Unlike the young drifter who had once worked only for a meal and a place to sleep, Jonah Calder now approached every sunrise with the quiet purpose of a man protecting his own future. His military pension and nearly 2 decades of careful savings could have bought him a comfortable life almost anywhere in the country. Instead, without hesitation, he used a large portion of those savings to pay the medical bills Graham and Mabel had hidden from him for years. When Graham discovered what Jonah had done, he was furious. "You didn't earn that money for us," he said, laying the bank statement on the kitchen table. Jonah looked at him calmly. "No," he smiled. "I earned it because of you." The old rancher had no answer. Over the following months, Jonah refused to solve every problem simply by spending money. That wasn't how Graham had taught him to build a life. Together, they sat around the same kitchen table where Jonah had once asked for nothing more than supper and a place to sleep, covering the worn surface with maps, notebooks, and old ranch ledgers. They planned everything. The cattle herd would be rebuilt slowly, instead of borrowed into existence through risky loans. Pastures exhausted by years of overgrazing would be rotated and reseeded before expanding the herd again. An unused hayfield along the western boundary would be leased to a neighboring rancher, creating reliable income without adding more work than Graham and Mabel could manage. The failing water system would be replaced section by section rather than all at once, ensuring every improvement could be maintained for years instead of becoming another burden. For the first time in a long while, the numbers inside Graham's ledger no longer felt like a warning. They looked like a future. Mabel watched the 2 men from the kitchen doorway one evening as they quietly debated fence locations and pasture rotation. Graham's voice had changed. It no longer carried the tired resignation she had grown used to over the past decade. There was life in it again. She smiled to herself. Years ago, she had placed an extra slice of bread beside a frightened young man's dinner plate because she sensed he expected to leave at any moment. Now that same young man was making plans that stretched 10 years into the future. Outside the barn, Saber rested beneath the fading evening sky, calmly watching the cattle drift toward fresh grass. His ears still lifted whenever unfamiliar vehicles passed the county road, but they settled just as quickly. Even the old Marine seemed to understand what his faithful companion had already accepted. Windbreak Ranch was no longer a place Jonah had returned to. It had quietly become the place where he belonged. Several weeks later, on a quiet spring morning, Graham asked Jonah to come inside before the day's work began. The kitchen looked exactly as Jonah remembered it nearly 20 years earlier. The same oak table stood beneath a window. The same coffee pot rested on the old stove. Morning sunlight still reached the room from the eastern fields, casting long golden shadows across the worn wooden floor. Time had left its mark everywhere except on the feeling of home. A thick envelope lay on the table. Jonah glanced at it and smiled faintly. "You shouldn't be showing me your will." Graham laughed for the first time in what felt like years. "It isn't my will." He gently pushed the envelope across the table. "It's yours." Jonah opened it. His smile slowly disappeared. Inside were legal documents prepared by an attorney in Lander. They were not inheritance papers. They were partnership papers. Graham had legally transferred part ownership of Windbreak Ranch into Jonah's name. Jonah immediately shook his head. "I can't accept this." "You can." "I don't deserve it." Graham leaned back in his chair, studying the man sitting across from him. The frightened boy who had once stood nervously outside his front door had disappeared so completely that it was sometimes difficult to remember they were the same person. "When your father lost his ranch," Graham said quietly, "life convinced you that you weren't worth believing in." Jonah lowered his eyes. "When we opened this door to you almost 20 years ago, we weren't trying to save a ranch hand." He smiled toward Mabel. "We were simply trying to do the right thing." Mabel reached across the table and gently rested her hand over Jonah's. "We had no idea," she said softly, "that one decision would save our lives someday." The room fell silent. Graham slowly turned the papers toward Jonah again. "I'm not giving you land." He paused. "I'm giving you the responsibility to protect what generations of Hartwells built, just as you've already been doing." Jonah stared at the documents for a long time before finally signing his name. Not because he wanted ownership, but because he finally understood what Graham was truly passing on. Outside the barn, an old leather collar still hung from a weathered nail beside the stable door. Patch's collar. The leather had faded with age, and the brass nameplate had lost much of its shine. But no one had ever considered taking it down. Jonah walked outside, carrying the signed papers, while Saber quietly followed beside him. The retired German shepherd stopped beneath the old collar. He lifted his nose, gently touched the worn leather, then settled onto the ground directly beneath it. Jonah smiled. For a long moment, neither man nor dog moved. It felt less like coincidence than quiet understanding. Years earlier, Patch had watched over a homeless young drifter until he found the courage to believe he belonged. Now Saber had taken his place, guarding the same ranch and the same family. Jonah looked across the green pasture, where cattle grazed peacefully beneath the Wyoming sky. Graham and Mabel stood together on the porch, smiling as they watched him. The silver pocket watch still rested safely against his chest, gently tapping with each heartbeat like a promise faithfully kept. After nearly 20 years of searching for somewhere to begin again, Jonah finally understood that the greatest gift he had ever been given was never the ranch itself. It was the family who had believed in him before he believed in himself. This time, when evening settled over Windbreak Ranch and the lights glowed warmly inside the farmhouse, Jonah did not wonder where tomorrow would take him. He already knew. He was home. And this time, he would never leave again. Every great miracle begins with one small act of kindness. Graham and Mabel opened their door to a homeless young man with no expectation of anything in return, never knowing that God was quietly writing a story that would come full circle nearly 20 years later. Sometimes the people God places in our path are not interruptions, they are opportunities to change a life, and perhaps our own. In our daily lives, we may never realize how much a kind word, a helping hand, or an open heart can mean to someone who has lost hope. God often works through ordinary people, doing ordinary things with extraordinary love. If this story touched your heart, please share in the comments about a moment when someone's kindness changed your life, or when you experienced God's faithfulness in an unexpected way. If you enjoy stories of faith, hope, and second chances, please like this video, share it with someone who needs encouragement, and subscribe to the channel for more inspiring stories. May God bless you and your loved ones with peace, strength, good health, and the courage to be someone's miracle today. Amen.